Start recording. There we are. Okay. So, right. Here, the Houdon portrait from Richmond also played a huge role in this translation of a true portrait that looks like Washington to a standard likeness that became accepted as Washington. Okay? And there's enough between the two that is similar, right? It doesn't make him totally different, right? But it does make him, this is George, not young George, right? Not George the general, not George the early president, George at the end of his life. That becomes sort of the standard image of this. Okay? So we'll be looking at others today, but we're going to look at is an artist who also, like Stuart and like Trumbull, and like Cotton, was a pupil of Benjamin West, right? We had mentioned on Friday that Benjamin West is really sort of the father of American painting, in that his pupils form the next generation of art, right? And so we've already looked at quite a few of these that had studied under him at one point or another. Remember that West had gone back to Britain in around 1760. And so these other artists that studied under him, Copley studied under him here, right, in the colonies. But the others had traveled and had spent time in West's studio in London, right? And this was the case for Charles Willson Peale as well. And whereas West is often pointed to, say that as he's pointing, West is often pointed to as the symbolic father of American painting. Charles Willson Peale is kind of the father of American painting. In other words, he had 12 children, right? And many of them, they were all named after artists, even the women, right? And there weren't that many women artists prior to the 18th century. He got short on people to choose from. But he had an Artemisia, right? And the boys were all named after Renaissance and Baroque artists. And he trained all of his sons in particular, in both art and science, which we'll talk about, right? And they all go on to careers in the 19th century, right? So West becomes this, like I said, the metaphoric father of American painting, and Wilson did it physically, so to speak, right? He's got kids that are deeply involved in the development of American art. Now, in this case, this is an over life-size portrait of John Beale Bordley. And Bordley was lifelong friends with Charles Willson Peale. They'd known each other forever. And in the early 1760s, John Beale Bordley gave Charles Willson Peale the money he needed to go to London to study with Benjamin West. Right? So that trip was funded by this man. This is then painted later after Peale gets back to the States, right, and shows the fruits of his studies. Right? So when he comes back to the States, Peale settles in the capital, which was not D.C. yet. At that point, the capital of the United States was Philadelphia. This is where Charles Willson Peale sets up his home, where he spends the rest of his life. In fact, to this day, the Peale name is very, very strong legacy in Philly, right? So, goes to London in the 1760s, studies under West. He had actually spent some time studying under Copley here prior to that, and then comes back in 1770s to paint Bordley. Charles Willson Peale was the first person to ever paint George Washington. The earliest portrait, this one, of George Washington, and again, not the standard likeness. We're not used to seeing young, dark-haired George, right, without the powder wig. Here he is prior to, even prior to the colonial army, right? This is not even prior to the Continental Army. This is when he's fighting as a general in the French and Indian War. Right? And you can see the date is really, really quite early. It's down in Lexington, Washington. Is that right? Where's Washington and Lee? Is that Lexington? Yeah. I'm not from here. I need some help with this sometime, right? Washington and Lee, and his colonel's outfit from the French and Indian War, right? So Peale as a portraitist. Another portrait, early portrait of Washington. He painted him a number of times at the Battle of Princeton, commissioned for Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And Peale made copies of this, at least 8 different copies of this early portrait of Washington. All of this well before Gilbert Stuart ever sat down with Washington to paint his portrait. Now, our Bordley picture on the left, the one from the National Gallery, is one of the earliest pictures he painted after getting back from London. It's one of his first works. Bordley was part of the Governor's Council in Maryland. He was a lawyer, as you might imagine, a judge. Right? And this painting is all about law. And in particular, the application of British law to Americans in the colonies. That's the underlying theme of the picture. To what degree is British law applied? To what degrees are British rights being respected? The rights of American colonists as British citizens. Okay? That's the underlying theme of the picture. And it was intended to be sent back to London to be shown in the Royal Academy show, since after all, Peale and Bordley were still British citizens in 1770, right? Intended to be sent back to London to be shown there to show the degree to which Britain is not respecting the colonies. And in particular, the rights of the colonial citizens of Britain. And what are the repercussions of that? Right? Do you, A, change the law to give them the right that the rest of the British citizens enjoy? Or is it time for independence? Right? The picture has something to say about that. So Bordley has this idea that he'll have it sent back to London. It'll be part of a series of pictures that he's actually going to commission from Peale, each one of them sort of driving this point home. Right now, the laws have got to change, or the colonies need to become independent. Right? That's the underlying message. So, around the picture of Bordley leaning on this rock, leaning on a book that's placed on a huge boulder, we have rising behind him on the left a peach tree. And Peale is really good with realistic detail and including things studied in nature, particularly enough that we can identify them. Right? So it's a peach tree in the background. Now, peach trees are indigenous to the United States. This was an important element to include an indigenous, not, not grafted plant variety, to show that America can self-sufficient, right? We don't need to import things. We can live here off our own. And directly behind the tree is a pack animal, right? Mule laden with goods. And again, this is about prosperity, right? The colonies are prosperous, right? So we've got everything we need. And on the other side, we see sheep, right, in the background as well. So it's all about sort of the prosperity of the natural situation here. We don't need Britain anymore. We can make do here. And what's interesting is that one of the principal imports from Britain at the time was cotton and wool. And so the idea of the sheep is there for the idea we don't need British wool, right? We can make our own. We're okay without you, right? Now he's gesturing, pointing to the right. And it looks like he's pointing at that statue that's kind of behind him, right? And on a certain level, that's what it does visually. It directs your attention that way. But in fact, the gesture is a gesture that's used in formal debate. So he's making a point, right? Shows in a pose that he would have been seen in the debate hall, right? And he's leaning on a book. Right, here's a detail of the book. Oh, I thought I had a detail. There we are. You can still see it there, right? Inside the book, it's in Latin. It's a legal text. And I'm not going to bother to read you what it says in Latin because, right? I'll read you what it says if it were in English. We are unwilling that the laws of England be changed. Okay? We are unwilling to have the laws of England changed. That's what the book says. Right? We are unwilling that the laws of England be changed. Now, that might seem weird if it's a book, if it's a painting that's all about America's prosperity and its potential to be independent from England, but that's really the bottom line. England would have to change its laws because it's not treating Americans well, or colonists well. And the book says we are unwilling that the laws be changed. Something else has got to change instead. And that something else is the relationship of the colonies to England. That's not the law, right? That's whether or not the colonies are independent. So we are unwilling that the laws of England be changed. And the quote goes back to the 17th century. It's Charles I who first said that. We are unwilling to change the laws of England. He said it to endorse the idea of a monarch sharing government with the parliament and those who would overthrow that idea. Right? We are unwilling to change the laws of England. So, in this case, it refers to the fact that English Constitution really can't be changed. And there are articles within the English Constitution that do not provide equal rights to the citizens of the colonies. Okay? And if you can't change the laws, your only recourse for the equal rights of people is independence. Right? The statue that it looks like he's pointing at is inscribed on the base. I don't know if you can see that down there. Lex Angeli, the laws of England. And it's English law, English justice, and there is a figure carrying a balance, the scales, the standard image for justice, right? Originally, I don't know if you can see this, but up here, there's another letter here, and originally it was going to say common law, common lex, or lex common. Right? So it's going to be that is specified. Right? They changed, and then the paint that painted over this ended up going transparent over time, and you can see the old transcription down below. So what we're seeing is a point where the artist decided that he's going to upend the cart and do it slightly differently and make it more specific about Britain. Right? So British law, as he points to that, leans on this book saying, the British Constitution can't be changed. At the base of the statue is an American plant, indigenous American plants, Jimson weed. It has narcotic properties. The seeds of the Jimson plant were used by Native American tribes as a hallucinogen. Right? So it's not only is it an indigenous plant, but it's an indigenous plant that could be used quasi-medicinally to alter your rational state. You can see where he's going with this, right? A symbol of irrationality growing at the base of the statue of British law. British law is irrational, right? Because the scales should, they're not because it's a statue, but things are out of balance. Right? And to drive then this all home, at his feet, behind him, is a torn document. And again, in English, it says Imperial Civil Law, a summary and proceeding. And it's been ripped in half, discarded. Right? So it's all about broken promises. Right? The underlying theme is that the British law is not being applied to citizens of the colonies. And that since British law cannot be changed, the only recourse is for independence, right? And unlike all of our other artists, right, there's up to now, right, Stuart stayed behind, but Copley and West go back to Britain. Charles Willson Peele stays here too, right? He's a real American artist now. None of these Brits, so to speak, right? And these are very much about now the importance of where America is going to be. Okay, we have a lot of Peele portraits. He was primarily a portrait painter, but I'm not going to go through a lot of the other ones. I want to kind of talk about what else Charles Willson Peele did and his legacy and his importance for American painting. Peele founded the very first American museum. Prior to Charles Willson Peele, if you wanted to go to a museum, you went to Europe. He founds the first American museum, 1784. The museum began as a collection of portraits of great American innovators. Right? So the famous portrait that you might know in the back of your head of Benjamin Franklin is Peele's portrait of Benjamin Franklin for his museum. And this idea of starting a museum that's all about American innovation, American intellectual progress, is in fact a theme that we see underscores all of Charles Willson Peele's career. What he's doing, both with his paintings and with his activities, is he wants Americans to be considered on the same level intellectually and culturally as Europe had been. He wants to turn the colonies from a ragtag group of people out in the middle of the sticks somewhere into a cultural, intellectual society that has the same Enlightenment, intellectual values as the Europe that they had come from. And prior to Peele, it doesn't have that. There isn't that opportunity, right? So the museum in 1784 is a key part of that, right? Opens the doors of the museum in 1786, right? He begins to work on it in 1784. It takes him a couple of years. He buys the building next door to where he lives, and that's where the museum is, right next door to his house, right, in Philadelphia. On the left, David Rittenhouse. There's a Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. I don't know if it's his family or not. Part of me thinks maybe it is, right? This is probably a posthumous portrait. He was a natural philosopher. In other words, he studied natural sciences, geology, botany, biology, right? Astronomy. In fact, the telescope was given to him by Ben Franklin that you see in the background. And we see him as an intellectual power, one who studies the world using the most modern equipment, studies books, maps, charts. He's a man of intellectual power. Right? And that's what he's trying to present him as, because he's trying to elevate the perception of that in America. Right? America as an intellectual center. He discovered a comet in 1793. That's probably why he's included here, right? And what he's doing with his finger is the map on the table. He's tracing the path of the comet that he discovered, right? So he earns himself a place in this pantheon, if you will, of great Americans. Now, like I said, there's a ideological support for this museum. He wants to raise the cultural profile of America, the perception, right? But he also wants to educate Americans, right? It's not just enough to have people think we're great. We've got to be doing something for ourselves. We've got to be helping the rest of society. And so Peele wants the museum not only to sort of be seen from outside as this great paragon of everything we've done that's good, But in addition to that, he wants it to be an educational institution. And to this day, American museums really focus on education. Right? National Gallery is very good with this. And so what he's doing here is he's showing us his museum. That is a really cool picture, right? It was actually commissioned when the museum was split apart and kind of swallowed. The Philadelphia Museum of Art got some of the paintings out of this. And when the Philadelphia Museum of Art began to get some of the works from the Peale Museum, they commissioned this painting as well. So it's up in Philadelphia, right? Commissioned by the trustees of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So we see Peale standing there showing us his museum. And there's this great artifice that somehow there's a... I love the fact that you can't tell... If you look at the top of it, right? It's almost as if the curtain is hanging in front of the canvas that we're looking at, even though he's standing within the space, right? It almost like it comes forward. But there's this idea that this is my job as the museum curator, is to, right? If I'm going to be Charles Wilson, my job is I've got this stuff together now. Please come and be educated, right? It's really proclaiming his role, the importance of his role as the father of American intellectual pursuit. His on the right, his palette with his paintbrushes, because of course he's a painter. And the museum was not just an art museum. As it started out with these portraits of American innovators, but it morphed from that into being a museum that had not only paintings, but also had taxidermied specimens, right, from natural science. So we see the turkey in the lower left corner, some taxidermy tools underneath it. That's the practice, right? Stuff at Philip, right? We got one of his sons really sick. They were using like arsenic, right, as part of what they were using for taxidermy. And one of his sons, Raphael, ended up getting, they're all named after artists. Raphael ended up getting really, really sick, right? Couldn't walk without crutches because of helping his dad with taxidermy. Well, there's that. He also sponsored a number of important archaeological digs, and we can see the bones in the lower right corner. And in fact, behind the curtain, we see on the left paintings of natural specimens. It's hard to tell if some of them are cages with natural specimens in them, right? It's a little hard to say. I always find it a little scary too, right? It looks like something from a 50s horror film. Please come in, like Boris Karloff where he played. But we also see this mastodon. You see that? Behind the curtain on the right, the bones of a prehistoric elephant directly behind him. And then more important, as we look inside the museum, as we work our way back into it, right? Up above, we see our portraits of great innovators. We see everybody. It's democracy. There's a woman. You wouldn't see that in Europe. At the museum by herself. There's a man with a child. Right? This is about education, about democracy, about opening up the world of knowledge to everyone. This is American values on display. Right? And again, commissioned when the Peale Museum began to be swallowed by other museums. Again, to be broken up much later. But it was founded and opened in the 1780s. Right? Begun the project in 1784, opened in 1786. And then 40 years later, parts of it end up shooting off to other places. This is how we wound up with the Rittenhouse portrait down here at the National Portrait Gallery, right, NPG. If you ever don't know what one of the abbreviations is, just ask. Right? But you'll get used to the 5 or 6 museums that we're dealing with. Baltimore Historical Society got quite a few of these works. And here we see a painting by Peale recounting how they found that mastodon skeleton in a farm in New York. And we see the actual excavation site draining the water from the pit so that they can bring forth this wonderful skeleton. There's Peale. Nice bit of spotlight on him, right? Selective sunlighting. Holding a chart, a huge scroll with a layout of how the bones are supposed to look so they know what they're looking for down there in the water. He is surrounded by a great number of his children. He's not done yet, I don't think. He had 2 different wives. The first one had 11, right? Not all of them, like six out of the 11 lived. First wife. She died. Who can blame her? Second wife. The rest. Both wives are there. You can see directly behind him that there are 2 women, right? One is a memorial to the previous wife. I don't know how wife number 2 felt about that, right? But the kids have gathered around as well, right? This range of kids that are there at the excavation site. And there is Charles Willson Peale in very much the same kind of guise as he was in his museum, which was painted later, which is the man that is directing the activity, the one who brings this to you. Right? Looking down into the pit, very class-oriented. He's not going to get down there himself, right? It's not Indiana Jones getting dirty to dig it up, right? He's simply directing the workers. And while everybody up on the hill on the right are portraits, all of the workers down below are not, right? They're just workers. And Peale is trying to show us, really, I think, what his agenda is, what he's trying to do, which is to direct the intellectual progress of America, just as he's here directing this particular excavation. Up in Philadelphia, again, this idea of all the Peale children, right? This wonderful picture called the Staircase Group. 2 of his kids, Raphael on the stairs and Titian peeking out up above. Raphael is spelled slightly differently, just as the kind of spelling from the 18th century that was normal. And I brought this in for a couple of different reasons. One, I think this is really is cool. It's for an 18th century work, it's strange. But it's a portrait of his kids, and who are an important part of his overall agenda. Right? The kids are going to follow in his footsteps. And Raphael indeed does become a painter. You see him here posing with not only palette with brushes, but also the stick he's leaning on is the kind of stick a painter would balance their hand on while they're painting details. Right? So a big canvas, right, is going to bounce a bit, and it becomes difficult if you're working in oil paints, which we don't do here. We don't have the ventilation for it. You're going to paint oils, they're wet for a very long time, much longer than wash or acrylic. And so there's always a danger of smearing it with your hand if you're going to do detail work, right? And so going back to at least the 17th century and even earlier, they would have a stick in the studio with a little sort of bob of leather on the end of it. And they would rest that bob on a dry part of the painting, and then you could rest your arm on something without the heel of your hand in the wet paint to do really precise detail work, right? Sometimes you just be off the edge of it, but sometimes with that little leather bob on the end. And that's what he's holding in his hand, right, is his paint bob, is what they call it, right? And so he could get in, Raphael could get in and do detail work, and Charles Willson did this as well. And in fact, the realism of some of his works, this one in particular, is quite striking. And he's playing with that idea, right? He's included a real step at the bottom. He included a real door jamb around the picture and had it mounted to the wall to give it this appearance of being real. And that comes out of using the paint bomb, right? To paint that kind of detail. The one that we see Raphael carrying there. There's a story that George Washington, who you remember he painted, walked by and did a double take. He just stopped and jumped out of his skin when he walked by the picture in the studio. Because it appears so very real. And even today, I got a detail, a different picture of this. Right? So, we'll get to that in a second, right? Hang on a second, we'll come back to that. There it is in person, right? For that, the way in which it tricks your eye, right? And it really has a really strong sort of presence this way. Now, going back to this slide. In addition to founding the first museum in America in the 1780s, right? Peale decided that in addition to having a place for people to go look at art and artifacts, right? Natural science and the arts, the museum, the Peale Museum, they should also have a place for artists to train to be painters. We needed a school modeled after the great academies of Europe. Now, by the 1790s, the French had a Royal Academy for training artists, going back to the 1640s. And the Brits had a Royal Academy for training artists, going back to the 1780s. We talked a little bit about that, the British Royal Academy. Peale decides that if America is going to be on a par with its European forefathers, it should also have an academy for training the next generation of artists. It's one thing that he has kids, but he can't do it all himself, right? So he founds what's called the Columbianum. Obviously named after Columbus, right? The Columbianum. That will then be a training ground, an art academy, specific art academy. And they're going to have annual shows, just as the French do, and the Brits do, right? It'll be a place for showing off artistic achievement, but also a place for training artists to paint well. The Staircase Group was submitted to the very first annual show of the Columbianum. Right? That's why he made it, was to include in this show. Eventually, and not too long afterwards, within about 10 years or so, the Columbianum became the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, PAFA, and it still exists today. PAFA is still there. Right? Has a fantastic art collection as well. So you can still go visit the school that Peale founded in Philadelphia. Like I said, it was an important figure for the development of America. Right? So, what we're seeing with Charles Willson Peale is this attempt, like I said, to bring art as an intellectual pursuit to America. Okay. There's that, and there's that. Rembrandt, one of his sons, right? They're all named after famous artists. Rembrandt Peale was a child prodigy, right? Trained in arts and sciences. All of his kids did. All of his kids helped with the museum in the 1780s as he's getting that going, and he trained each one of them not only to be painters, but also in the importance of studying natural science as part of being an artist, as part of being an intellectual in America. And Rembrandt followed this example. Right? Rembrandt was his third child, was a prodigy. He's already painting by the time he's 13 years old. Right? This is a self-portrait when he was 13. And, you know, considering he's 13, it's not too bad. It's a little stiff. And in fact, Rembrandt would carry this around with him. Rembrandt Peale would carry this with him and would show his students this picture and say, look, study hard and you'll get good. See, I used to suck. Right? And he would show them this as the fact that you're not going to be good as soon as you start. Right? Do the math. If he's 13 there, he's 17 painting George Washington. 17 years old. He gets a sitting with Washington. His dad arranged it. Right? And Rembrandt Peale was so nervous that Charles Willson Peale went with him. Right? And Charles Willson already knew Rembrandt, or Washington. Had been painting him off and on for 20 years by this point. Right? So he's friends with Washington. He goes there. He makes sketches alongside his son while the son is painting George. And the son is terribly nervous to be sitting with the president. Right? But it was all arranged by his dad. Interestingly enough, they got sittings with Washington on alternate days because this is the same time that Gilbert Stuart is painting him, and often. And so they would get him on Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and Gilbert Stuart would get them on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Don't quote me on the days, but you get the idea, right? And Washington eventually complained. It's like, I'm sitting for so many people. This is all I ever do is sit around for portraits anymore. But it's testament to how incredibly popular these things were. So here's our child prodigy, younger than probably all of you, right? Sitting with the president to paint his portrait. Washington remained an incredibly popular subject for American painting collectors. We don't really have the same kind of situation today. We haven't for a while. When I went to grad school in New York, I could remember going to coffee shops and everyone had a picture of Kennedy in it. This was back in the 80s, 90s, right? Everybody in these Greek coffee shops still had pictures of Kennedy. And I think that's the closest modern analogy we might have to the desire to have a portrait of the man who helped forge American independence, both during the time it's happening and in later generations. Right? This particular one was commissioned by this man, Saussure, Henry William de Saussure, who had been the director of the Mint, the U.S. Mint, under Washington. So he wants this to remember, right, his service under George, his connection to George, and keep that around his house. There are 10 different copies by Peale of this particular image that he painted from life. Right? He used these, would go back to his sketches and make different variations of exactly the same portrait again and again, just like we saw Gilbert Stuart doing. Right? And that is testament to how much people wanted these. In 1824, Rembrandt Peale is still doing images of Washington. This is 25 years after Washington's death. And in 1724, Peale decides to come up with a standard likeness. Right? He wants to have one particular image of George that he's going to use for all of his copies from this point forward. George has been dead for a quarter of a century. So Peale goes back and he does a little art historical study. He goes back and looks at all of his drawings. Right? If he has any copy paintings, he goes back and looks at those. He goes back and looks at the paintings his dad made and the drawings that they made together. He goes back and he looks at the paintings by Trumbull that we've seen and the paintings by Gilbert Stuart. And in particular, the sculpture by Houdon in Richmond. Right? And he takes elements from all of those and boils them together to come up with the standard likeness, which we see on the right. Father of Patriae Pater, the father of the country, right? Painted as if inscribed into the rock below. Rembrandt learning from his father this ability to fool your eye, where George's robe spills out of that oculus, where it gives you the sense that maybe there is a piece of stone around this painting, but all of it is artificial. All of it is painted. All of it has that same realistic detail that we saw with the staircase roof. But this is now the Patriae Pater image by George Washington, or by Rembrandt Peale of George Washington, becomes the standard likeness. Right? Almost in a way replacing Gilbert Stuart's. But again, he's deriving it from looking back at all of the different portraits to figure out what exactly does he want Washington to look like. He said what he was trying to find was what he remembered George Washington being. And this is a quote from Rembrandt Peale. Mild, thoughtful, and dignified, yet firm and energetic. That's what he's trying to bring to it, right? And he was never happy with this that he painted when he was 17. He was never happy with, in fact, that's why he stopped painting copies of this one, was because he had grown unhappy with it not capturing Washington's character well enough. And this is what leads him to do this study. And as we look at the face of the Richmond State House image, you can see that most people suggest that this one was the most important influence on the standard image, the standard likeness that Rembrandt Peale comes up with first in the Patriae Pater. Right? And this then becomes the basis for multiple copies. Right? So this one hangs in the Senate building. This one's in the National Gallery. You'll notice it also shows us this view through the rock, right? Through the stone oculus to see George. But you'll also notice here something we haven't really looked at yet much. Washington in military uniform. Most of our images of George Washington has shown him as the gentleman, right? Humbly dressed aristocrat. Nice but humble. Here we see him in his uniform as the commander of the Continental Army, the commander-in-chief. This is why we still call the president the commander-in-chief, right? Because Washington had really been the commander-in-chief, right? We still use that title today because of Washington's role. And that's the uniform he wore, right, as commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces. Even though a lot of our Washington portraits are in these aristocratic, humble clothes, we see an equal number of portraits of Washington wearing his Continental Army uniform. This one, Peale, he's marketing himself as, by the 1850s, right, when he does this copy of his Patriae Pater image. Peale was the only artist still alive who had actually painted Washington from sight, right? Everybody else had died by that point. But because he was only 17, right, needless to say, now, 55 years later, everybody else has passed away, right? So he's telling people, like, if you want a portrait of Washington, I'm the guy to come to because I'm the only one that's painting that's ever met the man, right? And he does not only versions of some, but he also does paintings after other artists, right? And the one on the right says this is painted by Rembrandt Peale from Pines, Washington. It's part of his marketing himself as the one who knows what he looks like. And this one is a copy of a portrait in the National Portrait Gallery by Robert Edge Pine, a British artist of Washington in his uniform in the Continental Army before becoming president. And you can see the degree to which Peale has borrowed fairly directly from this image. Now, one of Washington's uniforms actually survives here in D.C. in the American History Museum. You can go see it. And so that's what he's wearing, right, is this uniform, the Continental Commander-in-Chief, Continental Army Commander-in-Chief, with blue and yellow. And the buttons that you see, those can unbutton and button over the other side, right, to close it up. And so we see him here with it not buttoned down to those large brass buttons. Washington's Continental Army uniform. Now, none of the uniforms he wore in battle have survived. That kind of makes some sense. But he had another one commissioned for him when he became president. And he tended to wear it around. I can't imagine how that sat with people, right? He's still dressed as a military leader, even though now he's president. And by 1783, the war is over. But nonetheless, this one was commissioned for him as he became president. This is the one that we knew he wore during the time that Rembrandt Peale would have had contact with him, right? And we're lucky enough to have it here. And we see Washington wear it in a lot of different places. So another of the Capitol Dome frescoes by Trumbull shows Washington having resigned his military commission. And this is kind of key, right? This is a really important point. We talked about this before. Right? Washington had been the leader of the Continental Forces, and once the peace is established in 1783, when Britain recognizes our independence, in 1783, Washington decides that he is going to step down from the army, that his work is done. And for Washington, and he's going to retire entirely. He's going to go back, he's going to become a farmer in Mount Vernon. gentleman farmer, and that's it. He's done. Done with public life. I've done my duty. America, here you are. We did start. And so at this particular moment, he is now stepping up from the chair, the throne, if you will. He's handing over his resignation, giving it up. And we talked about how important this was because Washington could have parlayed the power and the respect that he had for the military into just simply becoming immediately the leader of this new country. Right? Without question, without democracy. And instead, he chose to resign his commission. And then, 6 years later, right, is elected as the first president in 1789 with the First Continental Congress. Right? So he's called out of retirement in order to become the president. It had to be the will of the people, not the will of George Washington. So this image that we see in the Capitol Dome, where he is now wearing this Continental Army uniform, is a real important linchpin in the establishment of American democracy and the way in which we choose our leaders. Right? I find it interesting, I don't have an answer for this, why he would continue to wear the uniform. Why he would get a new one commissioned for him as he comes out of retirement to take the office of president. And would wear it with some regularity, not all the time, right? But not infrequently. And I don't have an answer for that. Right? Why that might be. But certainly, insofar as portraits are concerned, it becomes an important element for the owner of the portrait because it commemorates a particular aspect of Washington's legacy, which is that prior to becoming president, he had led the Continental Army. Even if he appears old, as he was after resigning the commission. So there is no earlier version of this. The other Trumbuls that we saw, the Declaration of Independence image, for example, that's in the dome, came out of the earlier sequence of American history pictures that he had done. This was not part of that sequence. Right? This is a new composition for the Capitol Dome in 1823, the same time that Gilbert Stuart, right, is doing the Patriot image that we saw. All of them showing George in his continental outfit. Remember that Washington's dead by this point, and you'll notice as we look at George that in fact he's got that pose we've seen before, right? As he hands over his resignation papers, arm on his hip, it's in that exact same pose that we saw with the Lansdowne portrait, that we saw with other Trumbull portraits, that's based on the Apollo Belvedere, right? That ancient Roman statue. And part of that is because, of course, Washington's dead. And Trumbull is looking back at his earlier works, illustrating George Washington and using them the basis for the new one. Right? So you notice how malleable that pose can become. Right? Instead of handing over his papers here he's holding his telescope. Right? At the Battle of Trenton, about to lead the troops into this important battle. All of them based on ancient Roman statuary. With the idea that the government is commissioning works of art to decorate the Capitol, Rembrandt Peale decides, I got to get in on this, right? I'm the only living artist who, well, in 1825, Trumbull's still alive, right? But I'm an artist who's made a career out of illustrations of George Washington. I should get in on this game of decorating the Capitol. So he paints this massive picture, something like 12 feet tall, right? It hangs in the staircase in the National Gallery. It's like the only place they can put it is in the staircase. And Washington before Yorktown, one of the turning points in the American Revolution, right, 1781. And you'll notice that even though he's on horseback, it's that same kind of pose, right, with his arm out. And Rembrandt Peale painted this on spec, right? He just decided, I'm going to paint a massive canvas, and I'm going to show it to the people who are putting paintings in the Capitol, and they'll take it. They have to. It's great. And they did. being stuck with it. And it went on to his heirs as well, before it ended up, his children ended up selling it into a public collection. But the idea of making it in the first place was to illustrate a great moment in American history with the hopes that the Capitol would buy it and put it on display with all the other pictures they're buying at the exact same time. The danger, right? Trumbull had a commission. Rembrandt Peale was trying to get one. Right? So, during in the Continental Army, Washington was in charge of both American and French troops, right? In addition, we had numerous French fighting, and so the people behind him, in the back left, are an amalgam of both American and French troops, and then directly behind him, I think, is Hamilton, about to carry out his orders, right? But Washington is in charge. He's up front, gesturing back, using that same pose, in this case translating into "come follow me." At his feet, find my place here, right? I've lost the page. There we go. Good enough, right? At his feet is a plant, and again, we've seen the Peale family be very, very good with painting botany and closely observing nature. At his feet is a plant called mullein, or Aaron's rod. This is a medicinal herb, not a hallucinogen like we saw before with the Bordley picture by his father, but rather a medicinal plant that was believed to cast out evil spirits. So just as his father had included jimson weed as a symbol for the irrationality of British law, Rembrandt Peale includes Aaron's rod as a symbol of Washington's act expelling the Brits, establishing American independence. Now we'll end with one last picture by Rembrandt Peale, probably the best. This is my favorite Rembrandt Peale picture. It's his little brother Rubens. Again, right? You have lots of names out there to choose from. Rubens Peale, like Rembrandt, had been trained in arts and sciences, but decided not to become a painter. Right? He decided to become a botanist, a scientist. But he too had helped his dad on the Peale Museum, helped him with taxidermy, gathering of specimens. These were not just animal specimens, right? They were also plant specimens. And Rubens went on to a really strong career as a botanist. And here he is, he's 17 years old, Rubens is, at this point, right? Rembrandt, do the math, he's about 30, right? But again, he had like 12 kids, so they're quite a distance apart by age. And he's posing here with a geranium plant, a particular variety of geranium called a Waterloo geranium, named after the Belgian town. And Rubens Peale was the first one to successfully grow one in America, right? So he was a scientist, and no one else had figured out how to get a Waterloo geranium to grow here, and he did, and it's robust and it's huge, and it's testament to his intellectual capacity. And this is what we've been talking about with the Peale family all along, is the importance of American intellect and American progress and American innovation as something that Charles Willson Peale was deeply committed to and transferred to his kids. Right? They are doing things here not only artistic but scientifically. And then there's the realism of the picture. He looks out at us kind of over the rims of his glasses, right? We can see the little light in the side of his eyes, and we can even see the degree to which the lenses of the glasses, I got a detail of that, right, have refracted onto his face, how they heighten the sense of the light. And I think that there's something going on here that's really kind of interesting with that idea of the spectacles. First, you'll notice he's carrying another pair right down below, and his other hand is actually touching the dirt, right? And when Rembrandt Peale originally painted this, he painted him holding his glasses, right? Sort of thinking. And when you take your glasses off, you're no longer relying on sight and observation, you're relying on intellect. That's right, I can see. Right? And so that was the point that Rembrandt Peale was trying to get across, was this was about an intellectual pursuit. So there he is, he's got his glasses in his hand in the pot. Right? It's about his intervention, his actions, and his intellectual capacity. It's not just about the simplicity of observing. Right? He's not relying on that anymore. He's relying on what he thinks, what he remembers. Okay? The problem is that he got together with Rubens, and they both said, but everybody knows me with the glasses. Right? It doesn't look like me without the glasses. And I should have the glasses on because I look more like Rubens Peale, right? Like me, right? I look more like me with my glasses on when I put them up. And so he painted the glasses on. That means that whole idea of the refraction of the light is an afterthought, right? And the painting ended up in the collection of Rubens' daughter. And she wrote about it, and she said what happened, right? How it got painted. This is how we know that Rembrandt Peale added the glasses on the face later. Because the daughter said so. She said, Uncle Rembrandt, she said, came back and got together with Dad and decided that they needed to have the glasses for it to really look like him, right? And she also says that Uncle Rembrandt decided not to paint out the other pair of glasses because he was afraid of ruining the hand. Hands are tough, aren't they? Right? He didn't want to go back in there and ruin the painting of the hand by painting out the glasses. So we're left with two pairs. And I think that in a certain level, right, that kind of almost enhances this idea of the difference between observation, right, description, and analysis, which is necessary for intellectual capacity. Right? Observation is one thing. You need it. You've got to look closely. But that's only where we start. And this is true for you guys as college students, right? Observation is one thing, but it's just the start. The true work, the important stuff, is the analysis. What happens up here after that? What do you do with it? And that's this, right? That's the hand in the pot. Is that idea of what he's done with his observation. So beautifully painted, and also I think kind of a cool message as well. Okay, we're gonna let's see. On Friday, we will be looking at Titian Peale, and also moving from there to landscape. Getting set up for our discussion on Tuesday next of your first reading. So remember, your first reading next Tuesday, be sure you review those instructions on Canvas, right? If you have any questions about it, let me know.